Okay, welcome back everyone. So now we're going to do part two of the applied behavior analysis lecture. So we left off the last video talking about a paper written by Bear, Wolf, and Risley in 1968, right? So it was titled Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis. So what exactly does that mean? Dimensions, I tend to think of them as kind of the criterion for which to judge your research, right? So it's kind of the standard of applied behavior analysis, right? And so those three guys are considered the founding fathers of applied behavior analysis. And again, this paper is one of the most widely cited publications in applied behavior analysis. And you can imagine why, right? Because these are kind of like the guidelines and the standard for which we define and talk about our discipline of applied behavior analysis. So these dimensions are classified into 7, right? So we have applied, behavior, analytic, technological, conceptually systematic, effective, and generality. And again, this page is more of an overview. So I'm not trying to scare you yet. So you don't have to know them yet, but we will talk about them in depth, okay? So first, let's talk about applied. So I have a question for Carlos. What do you normally think about whenever you hear the word applied?
Doing the actual work, putting something into practice.
Exactly, right? And that's basically the embodiment of this dimension, right? So the idea here is to investigate what is considered socially significant behavior with immediate importance to the participant. So what does that mean, right? Exactly as Carlos was saying, the behavior has to be significant to someone. There has to be a reason why we want to change it, right? Either increase it or decrease it, right? And that behavior is important to that individual, right? It might have to do with their safety, their well-being, or their or something that they want to improve on. So applied dimension tackles behaviors that are important to everyone. It brings the principles of behavior into the lives of people. So the idea is we want to affect improvement or perform improvements in the behavior of individuals to enhance their lives, right? Improve their qualities of life. So some examples of this dimension, right? We've investigated all kinds of behavior, like social behavior. We've investigated language, academic behavior, daily living skills, self-care, vocational, right? Job-related skills, recreation and leisure, right? You'd be surprised that that's actually a skill that not a lot of individuals would widely know how to do, right? And sometimes it's something that has to be taught. So some of the application areas of applied behavior analysis, it's not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the areas where applied behavior analysts have come in and tried to produce that meaningful change. Okay, so autism, phobias, depression, right? Psychotherapy, systems analysis, gambling addiction, self-injury and aggression, right? Education, all the areas where behavior analysts have worked and produced meaningful changes. So then we're going to do some exercise, right? We're going to go through some questions and try to determine if they are considered applied based on the definition of the dimension, okay? So Jimmy frequently puts small objects in his mouth. Behavior analysts are hired by the parents to decrease behavior. Is this an applied question? What do y'all think? Carlos, what do you think?
Oh, me? Yeah, I think this is definitely applied.
Yeah, and I agree, right? Because we're changing a behavior that's dangerous to Jimmy, right? Because if he eats that small object, what could happen? Be a choking hazard, he could choke and die, right? We don't want that to happen. So as behavior analysts, we get called in and we will work with the parents to try to decrease that behavior and teach them probably an alternative. So Ted frequently smokes cigarettes. His coworkers contact a behavior analyst because he wants to quit smoking. And he's tired of smoking, of the cigarette smoke odor in his office. So is this an applied question? What do you guys think? I think it is, right? Because he's affecting meaningful changes to individuals, right? So cigarette smoking, we know that can produce lung cancer in the future, right? It has a lot of negative effects on health. So changing that would definitely be an applied question. So behavior analysts are conducting research to teach a rat to press a lever. Is this applied? Probably not, right? Although we have used that method to understand the principles of behavior, there isn't an immediate implication for the well-being of the rat, right? And it doesn't just have to be humans. You can have applied research with animals, right? People that want to produce meaningful changes. For animals would definitely fall into the umbrella of applied. So here we have John frequently engages in sports gambling behaviors and has lost a lot of money. He goes to work for a nonprofit organization that has a behavior analyst on staff to try to get control over his gambling behaviors before it's too late. Is this applied? I think so, right? Because here again, sports gambling could be really, really detrimental to the well-being of John, right? He could bet all his money away, end up living on the streets because he has no money, loses his home, loses his family. So by intervening, right, we can definitely produce meaningful change for this individual.
Yeah, and I think going back, I think one important thing also to remember with applied is that social significance, right? It might be a little bit subjective, but we go off of what's important to the people that we're helping, right? So even though you might not think it's very significant, it's all about if it's significant for that specific person, right? So you might think, you might get called in, hey, I just want to improve my relaxation, right? Because that was one of the examples that we gave in the previous slides, just relaxation behaviors. I want to relax a little bit more. To you, you might say, oh, relaxation isn't really important for your health. Like, what are you talking about? But to them, it might, right? It might have implications over time. Maybe they are stressing. Maybe you need more relaxation behaviors to engage in other different behaviors. So it's all about what the client, how it's important to the client and not just society itself. Because there is going to be a lot of issues. There is going to be a lot of times when it's cross-cultural social significance, and that's something to take into consideration too. Only because it's not important in our culture doesn't mean it's important to different people's culture.
Very good point. Okay, so again, if you have questions throughout this, please make sure you write them down and send it to us, okay? So next, we're gonna talk about behavioral. So what do we think when we hear this, right? Hopefully, we think about behavior, right? So it's in the name. So what does this mean is that in applied behavior analysis, as we do in behavior analysis overall, we wanna have a focus on behavior. We wanna measure behavior. Because why do we measure? To see the changes, right? So we can see how behavior changes as a function of coming into contact with the environment, right? So of course, applied behavior analysis, no different, right? We want the precise measurement of actual behavior in order to improve and document that the participant's behavior has changed, right? We don't really want to work with any kinds of states or any kind of like mentalistic notions, right? Because at that point, we're going past the behavior. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So behaviors are identified as the issue that needs to be changed. The behavior must be measurable. And whose behavior has changed? This is a really, really important question to keep in mind, right? Because whenever you're doing research or whenever you're out in the field, changing behavior, you have to consider, is it my behavior as the person that's collecting data being changed? Or is it the individual, right? So you got to have protections to make sure that it's not you that's changing your criterion for measurement, and instead you're actually capturing the behavior of the individual you're interested in working with, right? So it's making sure that the data collection systems are implemented with fidelity, right? Are you measuring what you say you're measuring, or are you measuring something else? So again, we're going to go through a little exercise to determine if some of this stuff is behavioral or not, okay? So Gavin believes that he hasn't been happy lately because he has had the wrong attitude. So a behavior analyst is hired to help him have a better attitude. So would you guys consider this behavioral? I wouldn't. So one of the reasons is because they're talking about things such as wrong attitude or better attitude, right? Or a criterion such as happy. Why? Because these things look different across individuals, right? So one of the things that we could do for this specific situation to make it more behavioral is, as Carlos always says in class, right? What behavior are we looking at? So we would try to consult with Gavin and try to figure out what the behavior he's actually wanting to change, define that, and then we can start using that as the basis for whatever Gavin is describing as having the wrong attitude or the better attitude, right? So here's another one. A behavior analyst is working with an undergraduate student, helping them with their shooting form. And here we're talking about basketball. So would this be behavioral? Yeah, right, because the behavior analyst is working with the topography of the form of the basketball player, right? The topography is going to be very influential when it comes to the function, right? Getting the ball on the hoop. So this would definitely be behavioral because he is focused and measuring the behavior of the individual. So Jessie wants to increase the number of conversations she has with her classmates. Do you guys think this is behavioral? I would say yeah, right? Conversations. You can hear people engage in conversations. You can keep track of the conversations. You can measure them. You can see how they change, right? All these things are things we can actually measure and work with. So a behavior analyst is hired to increase academic engagements of students at a public school. So he measures the number of times that the teacher complains about a student. What do you guys think about this? It's a little bit more of a difficult one. So I think this is behavioral, but one of the things that we would want to do, as you can kind of see here, we would want to take a label, right? Academic engagement. What in the world is that? What does that look like? We'd ask the people that are hiring us that want this kind of change, right? So they would tell us that maybe it's the number of times that students are oriented toward the teacher and raising their hands, right? That's what they mean by academic engagement. After that, then we have something to work with. And then we'll create measures and interventions to try to get at and increase and improve that kind of skill.
Yeah. With this one, I think you always want to ask, is the behavior that people are saying they want to change, if you could picture that behavior and what it looks like, and if that behavior is made up of a million other behaviors, then that label itself is probably really, really general and really broad, which means that you're probably not measuring one behavior, right? So if you can keep trickling down, it's the very last thing that you can picture, and that's the behavior that you really want to look for, right? So for example, on this first one, they're talking about attitude, right? I can picture how do we measure attitude? Well, attitude's probably made up of a lot of vocal behaviors, right? A lot of negative statements, positive statements, whatever the case may be, but it's multitude behaviors, right? So if it has a multitude of behaviors, you're probably not measuring an accurate behavior. So it's always, for example, in the second one, if it's shooting form, there's only one way to, although there might be different ways to shoot, if you can say shooting, this is a shooting form behavior, then that's more of an accurate measurement on what you're really looking at.
Cool. Yeah. So the next one we're going to talk about is analytic. And keep in mind, I think one of the two that are most difficult for people to understand, including myself, it took me a while to get this differentiation or to let's just learn about them generally, are probably analytic, conceptually systematic. So right now, we're going to talk about analytic. So basically, right, think of this one as tying together with single subject research, right? And this is asking the question, are we sure that we are influencing the change, or is it something else, right? So are we demonstrating that we have experimental control over the behavior, right? So again, going back to that ABA reversal baseline, right? Are we turning the behavior on and off? Because that would show an extreme level of control over the behavior, right? So here we have on the top graph, baseline, right? We see that behavior is low, we implement an intervention, goes up, right? But just that comparison isn't enough to say, okay, that I have produced that change. So we do a reversal and we see the same effect. Then we show that we have experimental control. And this is exactly what we mean by analytic, right? Are we sure that the results are produced by what we say they're being produced by, right? So do you see those functional relationships? Are they replicable, right? So basically what this is you want to demonstrate that your treatment and not something else is producing the behavior change. So here we have two questions, right? And I want you guys to think about whether they're analytic or not. So you've decided to evaluate the treatment to reduce Brian's hand biting, right? So this individual constantly bites on their hands. After 2 weeks, his hand biting is occurring less frequently. Is that analytic? So 2 weeks go by, he does it less often. Is this analytic? Probably not at this stage, right? Because we don't know if it's just the passage of time that produced the hand biting or if it's the intervention. So at this point, we'd probably want to implement some kind of research design, right? Maybe a reversal to see if it's the intervention that's producing results or something else. Okay, so what about the other one? You're trying a new way to teach reading to Matt. At the same time, Matt's home therapist is beginning a reading program. So here you have two different people teaching Matt how to read. Is this analytic? Probably not, right? Because they're not systematically being presented as a packaged intervention. They're two separate things. So if you see the reading behaviors of Matt improve, right, however we define it, we're not sure what's causing the change. It could be the way I teach reading, or it could be the way his home therapist teaches reading, right? And that is definitely going to be confound the results. So you would want to separate them out and again use some kind of research design to verify or analyze what's actually producing the effect for this individual.
And I think one good thing to remember on here is that whenever you look at other sciences out there, there are some that have multiple variables going on at the same time, right? Maybe they do have 3 different ways they could teach someone how to read, and as long as they get that reading behavior going up and increasing, that's all they really care about, right? And which is great, definitely whenever you're trying to teach a skill. But for us, what we want to do is say, I know for sure which variable it is that taught Matt how to read. And the reason why is because now it's going to be easier instead of using 3 different interventions that may cost money, that may cost time, and may and just in general take a lot longer during an intervention. You want to just pick that one that actually worked or was causing those results and then apply it to a lot more people, right? Or a lot more children.
Exactly. Okay, so here we have the next dimension. So this one's technological, right? And typically whenever we talk about technological, we think about technology, or at least that's what I think about. So that's basically the same idea here, right? So instead of electronic devices, we're talking about the technologies derived from behavior analysis. And remember, technological is a broad term, so it doesn't just have to be technology, like electronic devices. It could also be the interventions and procedures that we use, right? So the technological intervention, or technological dimension, basically states that all your procedures have to be described well enough for them to be replicated, right? So if I create a procedure or an experiment, I have to basically clearly outline every component, every aspect of the experiment in a way that someone that's totally unrelated to my experiment can replicate the results or can try to replicate the results. So for instance, I would give that description to Carlos, and his job as someone that's interested in the same phenomenon, for him to try to independently see if he can assess if he receives the same results using my methodology, right? So this is a very important dimension. Whenever you write any kinds of interventions, any kinds of research papers, make sure that it's technological, right? Write it well enough for anyone else to replicate, right? Everything has to be identified and described in detail and clarity. So now we're gonna go over some more examples, okay? So the experimenter is measuring the amount of attention a student is paid during class. Is this an example of technological? Maybe. In the way it's written here, I don't think so, right? Because I know that the experimenter is trying to measure attention, but what does that look like? Am I going to be pinpointing the same behavior that he's identifying as intention? Probably not, and I don't know this because he didn't specify. So we want to be more specific with that. So in this case, this would not be technological. However, what if this was what they actually wrote? So the experimenter defined as student attention as the number of times the student oriented toward the teacher, raised their hand, and discussed class-related material with the teacher. A trained data collector was present in the room at all times. The data collector recorded each occurrence of student engagement using a tally system on a data sheet. Could someone replicate that? Yeah. Could I write that and then give it to Carlos for him to go measure the same exact thing in his class? Yes, we could, right? So that's what we mean by technological. Describe it well, in detail, clearly, in a way that could be easily replicated by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Anything to add?
Yeah, and so some of the most important reasons on why you want to make something as detailed as possible is because you really want to know if it's something that you came across that's really, really that's really great for the field to know. And you want to know if it's gonna generalize to different environments, right? So just as Will was saying, if he finds a way, an intervention to teach children how to read a lot quicker than anything that's out there, but if he doesn't write it down in detail, I'm not going to be able to teach anyone how to read, right? Because I just can't replicate it. But if he does write it very detailed and I can replicate it, and let's just say everyone that I get that intervention to doesn't end up picking up how to read, then maybe maybe the results only happen with Will, right? And we want to know that, because if he starts advertising that, hey, this is a great plan, maybe it's really not, because other people couldn't, they did replicate it, and maybe the results just weren't really generalized on there.
Mm-hmm. So here we have another one. And again, this is another kind of tricky one to get for many people, including myself. But this is the trick that I've kind of worked out to remember this. So this one's conceptually systematic. And the way I kind of translate that or equate it is, how is this tied to the principles of behavior? That's basically what it's saying, right? So in applied behavior analysis, we have a lot of techniques and procedures to influence behavior changes of individuals, okay? So with this dimension, it's asking you, what principles are at play that are changing this behavior, right? So if I implement a differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior procedure, how am I going to tie that to the principles, right? So here we have two principles at play. We have reinforcing an alternative behavior. We have placing the problem behavior on extinction, right? That's conceptually systematic because we brought the principles and translated them into or the other way around. We brought this procedure or intervention and translated it into the fundamental principles that are at work, right? So we just always want to tie back to the science. So another thing is that by doing this, we're better able to teach individuals that all these different techniques and procedures, right, are all based on the same framework, right? The idea that we're a science, that we're a framework in which to view the world, all of this together, it's the wrong one. It's in my room. All of this together, right, helps tie them and show them that this science is one piece, or like it's a whole, right? It's a whole field that works together. And so then we have this other one, which is, it also helps turn our field into, going back to that last one I was talking about, it helps bring our field into unison, right? So basically, we're not just a collection of tricks, like, right? You're not just gonna pull something out of your hat and say that this intervention works, right? There's a systematic knowledge base where we have worked a lot of these things out. So some examples, right? So timeout. A lot of people have heard about this procedure. It's probably, even though people don't really know it, it's probably one of the things that people are most familiar with, right? It actually comes from behavior analytic principles. So as many of you know, timeout doesn't always work. But here's the thing, here's the way you implement the procedure, again, going back to the technological aspect, matters. So in the cases where timeout doesn't work, it's because it was either implemented incorrectly, or it wasn't tied to what was maintaining the behavior. So the full intervention is actually timeout from positive reinforcement. So what it looked like in the operant chamber, right? Because it originated as a basic procedure or basic operant procedure, right? With rats and pigeons, it's whenever an organism engaged in the incorrect response, what the person would do, or the experimenter, they would literally grab the rat, take it out of the cage, put it in its home cage for like 5 minutes, and then put it back in the cage, right? So this functioned as a negative punisher. And that's the idea behind this procedure. But if you implement it kind of arbitrarily without knowing if what the behavior is maintained by is positive reinforcement, then it won't work, right? Same thing with the good behavior game. This is actually a pretty cool procedure that's commonly used in classes. And we actually have a really good friend from undergrad who went to go get her master's in, where was it, Dublin, Ireland? in Wales, and she actually did research on this paradigm. So what happens is you have a class, you divide them into teams and have them work to get points or give them a maximum number of points and take away. And basically the idea is by providing those group contingencies, you're able to have the class engage in more preferable behaviors than acting, crazy, talking out loud, and doing things that are kind of counterproductive to a classroom setting. So, and again, if applied properly, it's going to work, and it's always tied back to those principles, right, of reinforcement, punishment, stimulus control, right? It always goes back to the framework. So again, one of the common things that we've seen, not just in this class, but in all the classes that we've helped in over the years, is that people typically get confused whenever we talk about principles of behavior. I guess we kind of take it for granted that we know what it means, but never, I guess, really describe it. So this is our opportunity to do that with you guys. Whenever anybody talks about the principles of behavior, we're talking about describing how behavior works, right? We're talking about how the principles are the concepts that we use. So reinforcement is a principle. Extinction is a principle. And all these principles, right, together grow and become techniques, right, once we combine them systematically. And so those interventions that are derived from those principles are what we use to change socially significant behaviors.
Yeah, I think what this one is, to summarize what Will said as far as me on how I take conceptually systematic, is just the way he said it, right? As long as you look at a procedure, as long as you look at techniques, and as long as you look at any kind of article and you can say, oh, look, they're using reinforcement. Oh, look, they're using extinction. As long as you're identifying things that we either found in the lab or found in the real world that do have lawful orderly relations, then those are the principles that we're talking about, right? Those are the same concepts that you've been learning in 2300 and 2700. As long as you can pinpoint those being used effectively in the article, then we consider that conceptually systematic, right? It's not just somebody going out with a client and saying, I think this might work, here you go. I think this consequence might be the thing that's maintaining it, so let me eliminate it. It's not about just throwing a bag of tricks, right? Like just throwing anything and see what sticks. It's, yes, this is reinforcement. I see it in his life or her life. Now I can manipulate those things, right? As long as you can say that, it's conceptually systematic. As long as you're always coming back to reinforcement, extinction, the different kind of things that we talked about as principles or concepts, it's conceptually systematic. Because if it's not that, I don't consider it behavior analysis. Because if you're not using any one of the principles in your studies, in your articles, in your interventions, then you're probably in another realm, right? You're probably using another sciences, dimensions or principles or whatever the case may be.
Okay, so another one is effective. What do you guys think that one means? Exactly as you thought, did it work, right? But this is kind of setting up a criterion, right? So the goal is, are you improving behavior sufficiently to produce practical results, right? But think about it, and it makes sense, right? If let's take this guy, right? He likes to chew on things. If his rate of chewing is, let's say, 10 times a minute, right, which is a lot. If we reduce it to 9, we create an intervention, we turn it to 9 chews a minute. Is that effective? Did it work? Technically, yeah, right? Because it did reduce his rate of chewing, but we wouldn't count that as effective based on this dimension, right? Because he's still damaging his teeth. So this is setting up the criterion that the change has to be meaningful for the individual. And it's a kind of a combination of determining that, right? So it's going to be his judgment as the person that is able to kind of describe that, and me as knowing, like, if I investigate, or this dentist maybe, right? Combination of all that will determine what that criterion is set to, right? Because it has to produce meaningful and practical results. So if we are effective, we're basically saying that the improvements of behavior have reached some kind of clinical or social level of significance. So let's look at the graph on the left, right? So we have the amount of time on the x-axis, we have the problem behavior on the y-axis. We have two conditions. We have baseline and we have intervention, which is here non-contingent reinforcement. Would you consider that a meaningful change or a practical meaningful change? Just by the looks of it, I would say there was very little change. So I would say this intervention didn't really work. But now let's contrast that to the one on the right. So we see an experimental design, right? It's not just comparing two conditions. It's a reversal. So in baseline, we see rates about between maybe, let's say, average of 40%. And then we'll go to the NCR condition. We see that it drops down to about, let's say, 20%. In this case, let's say that is a meaningful change, right? Then we do a reversal, right, to make sure we're still analytic. And we see that the behavior goes down. Would you say that this was effective? Yeah, right? Not only were we demonstrating that the intervention was functionally related to the behavior change, we also have shown that this intervention produced meaningful results for the individual.
Yeah, I think with this one as well, just kind of what Will touched on a little bit earlier was it kind of like applied as well, right? It's going to be dependent on the individual and the behavior. If it's a behavior that's not so dangerous, if it drops by one instance, we might consider it not as effective. But if it's a really dangerous behavior, if someone's banging their head against the wall, even a slight decrease might be effective, right? It just depends on the behavior, and it depends on how detrimental it is to that individual, no matter what that behavior is. If it's important for me to stop chewing my pen because I'm getting punished by by my friends, by my peers, then it might be, right? It might be very significant. So just dropping it down to a little bit in frequency might be effective compared to someone else.
So next, we're going to go through some examples, okay? So actually, no, we're going to talk a little bit more. So how do you know that you've reached this meaningful change, right? Or social significance? Well, one way is you can just ask people, right? So some form of feedback given by the consumers, right? Are they happy with the results? Is it changing their lives in a meaningful way, right? So you can evaluate the social validity of your goals, right? Is my mission valid to the individual? Are the procedures meaningful, right? So what we mean by that one is that we can use a reinforcement procedure to change behavior. We can also use a punishment procedure to change behavior, right? I could reinforce an alternative behavior, or I can punish his chewing on pens. Which one do you think he would prefer? Probably reinforcing an alternative, right? So that's what we mean by assessing the social validity of your procedures. Outcomes, right? It ties back to, is the change meaningful to that individual or is it not? So you could evaluate this in many ways. You can ask people. There's also now been recently developed questionnaires that you can use to more systematically assess social validity, but you'll learn that in different classes. Anything to add? Cool. So now we'll go through some examples. So a behavior analyst wants to decrease the rate of self-injurious behavior in an individual from 5 responses to 4 responses a minute. The family is happy with the result. Do you guys think this is effective? I would say, yeah, possibly, right? Because the family's happy with the result, but there's a little bit of a conundrum here, right? Especially because that individual is still hurting themselves, and it seems to be at a pretty significant rate. So then we would probably ask the individual themselves, are you happy with the results if they're able to respond? Or if not, we'll probably consult with a medical professional that's familiar with this individual and see if they're causing any long-term damage. And if it's not, then maybe it might be effective. And if not, even if the family's happy with the results, right, because they're desperate, it might not be effective, right? So here's where we're going to start to consider all those different kinds of variables. So let's say that behavior analyst helps the basketball player improve his three-point shooting percentage from 29% to 33% over the course of the season. The participant and the coaches are very happy with the improvement. So I'm sorry for the excessive basketball references. This was from last year, and the basketball season was currently in full force, or was in full force at the time. So I guess that was kind of like a byproduct. But okay, so this one's an interesting one because I'm a big basketball fan. He's not. So Carlos, is 29% to 33% a significant change? Yes or no?
I would consider it not that great of a significant change.
Exactly, right? But this is what we mean by kind of the getting an understanding of the kind of the background of like the individuals in the field, right? Someone that's familiar with basketball, my opinion of social ability is different, right? Because of the histories. So in basketball, a good 3-point shooter is at 35%, right? So to change from 29% to 33% over the season, it's a drastic change in basketball. So to me, that would be effective, right? And it's important to kind of get like that background information because it's again based on a combination of like kind of the different viewpoints, right? From the people around the individual, from that kind of what's known in that area. It's all kinds of variables that you got to keep in mind. So a behavior analyst is working with an individual at a brain injury rehabilitation center, right? So he's teaching individuals to tact. You guys aren't familiar with that concept yet. That's from verbal behavior, so I'll go ahead and explain what that means. Think of tacting as a label, right? So this individual is able to label 30 items in his bedroom. So if I go to my room, I see a bed, I see a lamp, I see a book, I see clothes, etc., right? So this individual can do that in his bedroom he can name 30 items in 30 seconds compared to his baseline of 3 in 30 seconds. Is that effective? Yeah, right? Because his repertoire of being able to label things increased drastically, right? Given that that standard of 30 seconds. So that would be effective. Okay, so now let's talk about generality. So this one's, again, another one of the tricky ones. So we're going to kind of walk through this one. So basically what this one is asking, or the dimension, what it's requiring is that the behavior lasts over time. The behavior change lasts. So for example, if we produce an intervention and the behavior changes for a day, and then after we leave, goes back to the levels it was. Is that generality? Probably not, right? Because it didn't maintain over time. So one of the things we want to do as behavior analysts, we want to be specific and we want to be making sure that these results are going to withstand the test of time, right? So we have to program for generality. We have to produce interventions that are going to last over time. And it's kind of different than generalization in a way, because remember, whenever we talk about stimulus generalization, we're talking about a very specific context or a very specific concept, right? Stimulus generalization, you're talking about an individual engaging or emitting an untrained response in the presence, untrained response in the presence of an untrained stimulus, right? Just because the stimulus has similar features to another one. So what we mean by generalization in this case is, does this behavior move to other environments or appear in other environments, right? So if I learn to say hello to people in the living room, if I go outside to the Department of Behavior Analysis, did I engage in the behavior? Did it emerge? And one of the things to keep in mind with this kind of concept is that you don't teach, you don't expect this to happen. You have to teach it, right? You have to set up the conditions for generalization to occur, right? Just hoping that it occurs really isn't sufficient. You have to keep in mind generalization whenever you implement interventions. So another thing, if I teach you to engage in a behavior, did it spread to other behaviors, right? So if I learned to say hello to other individuals, so like let's say I learned to say hello to professors, am I now more likely to ask the follow-up question like, how are you, and instigate conversation, right? Did it spread to other kinds of behaviors? And what this would look like in the applied setting is, let's say we have an individual with autism, right? We're teaching them to engage in cooperative play with their peers, right? So that's one of the things that they definitely have trouble with. So question one, did it generalize to other environments? So I taught the kid how to play with their peers in the classroom. Do they now go home and play with their siblings and their cousins, right? If I teach them how to play for spreading to other behaviors, are they now more likely to talk to their peers, right? I didn't specifically train them or teach them to talk to their siblings or cousins, but does it occur anyways? And again, we always want to make sure we do that with our interventions. So let's run through some more examples. So behavior analyst decreases the amount of time a student uses the curse words at home. When the student is at school, curse words are used very often. So does this exemplify generality? I don't think so, right? Because the behavior is reduced at home, but in other circumstances, right, at school, it's occurring at the same rate. So this might not be highlighting generality. So a student is working on a behavior change project and decides to intervene on their social media usage. As soon as the project ends, the rates of social media usage goes back to baseline. Is this an example of generality? Again, probably not, right? Because the intervention only lasted as long as the behavior change project was in place, right? And as soon as you took it away, it went back to baseline levels. And what that kind of exemplifies, right, is going back to the idea of, does it maintain over time? Here, it did not maintain, so it probably wasn't an example of generality. And so another one, behavior analyst is creating a MAN program with children with autism. So again, MAN is another of what we call a verbal operant, and it's basically a request. So were you creating a program where we teach a child with autism how to request for things? So they are taught to MAN or request for preferred items and breaks during academic activities at the clinic, right? And now whenever the child goes home, he's able to request for items and breaks at home as well. Is this generality? Yeah, right? Because he was trained a skill at the clinic and it's now starting to occur at home. And since it's occurring at home, it's a lot more likely to maintain, right? Because those are a lot more practice opportunities. So that would be a great, great example of generality. So we've talked about all 7 dimensions and a good way to remember them, right? This is a mnemonic device that actually I learned when I was taking, I think it was behavior, 3770, which was survey of applied behavior analytic literature. So remember, get a cab, right? And if you remember this, you'll remember the first letter that each dimension starts with. So then you'll have generality, effective, technological, applied, conceptually systematic, analytic, and behavioral. Okay, so now we're toward the end, and we're just gonna kind of overview of what exactly is applied behavior analysis, right? So we actually have a definition for this. So it's kind of broken down into 7 components, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 components. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about them briefly. So basically what applied behavior analysis is, it's a science in which we use the tactics derived from the principles of behavior, right? So it's basically saying, again, conceptually systematic, it's all our procedures and interventions are tied back to the principles of behavior, right? We apply them to the world systematically, right, to produce meaningful change, and we experiment, right? We use our research designs to make sure that the variables we implement are what's responsible for the behavior change. And this is really what makes applied behavior analysis, along with the dimensions, what it is, right? It's a focus on producing meaningful change for individuals, all individuals. So remember, in a nutshell, what applied behavior analysis seeks to do is to produce meaningful improvements in the important behaviors of individuals to achieve an analysis, right, of the factors responsible for that improvement. Basically what they're saying, you have to ask yourself 2 questions to see if you're actually doing applied behavior analysis properly. Are you producing a meaningful behavior change in an individual, right? And 2, are you sure that you're what's producing the change, or is it something else? If you fulfill both those requirements, you change a meaningful behavior and you're responsible for the improvement, then what you're doing is applied behavior analysis. And another quick note, just something to keep in mind, behavior analysis is a big, broad field, and basically specialties are determined by what you want to know, right? So behavior analysis is the umbrella term. Within it, we have sub-disciplines, right? So we have radical behaviorism, the philosophy of the science of human behavior, right? As laid out by Skinner and a lot of other behavior analysts. We have the experimental analysis of behavior, right? Where we start to see the orderly changes in behavior and understanding behavior for behavior's sake. Then we have translational research, right? Where we study the principles with humans, right? Do these principles extend to other areas outside of the laboratory? Then we have applied behavior analysis, right? Are you producing meaningful change and identifying that you're the change agent for those changes, right? And then we have the practice, where behavior analysts actually are on the floor and working with all kinds of populations producing these meaningful changes. So that's all we have for now. And followed by this, we're going to be talking about the techniques and applied behavior analysis. Hope this was helpful. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.